Chapter 1. Places we go. When things are uncertain or too much, stress, overwhelm, anxiety, worry, avoidance, excitement, dread, fear, vulnerability. Imagine the chaotic intensity of a restaurant operating at absolute maximum capacity. The dining room is a cacophony of demanding voices, clattering plates, and relentless urgency. There is a precise, shared language among those who navigate this specific brand of chaos. When the demands begin to outpace the hands available to meet them, you are in the weeds. To be in the weeds is to be entangled, fighting through a thicket of immediate, pressing tasks. You are behind, you are struggling, but you are still functioning. You can still articulate what you need to survive the shift. You can call out for an extra set of hands, a missing order, or a moment of grace. The tension is palpable, but the cognitive machinery is still turning. However, there is another state entirely. It is a threshold crossed when the sheer volume of input short-circuits the system. In the language of the kitchen, this is being blown. When you are blown, the noise of the dining room recedes into a muffled buzz. Time distorts. You are no longer fighting through the thicket. You have simply stopped moving. If someone asks what you need, the mind goes blank. The capacity to formulate a plan or even to speak completely dissolves. You are standing in the middle of a burning room, absolutely paralyzed. This vivid contrast serves as the perfect map for understanding two fundamental yet distinct human experiences. The sensation of fighting through the thicket is what we call being stressed. Stress arises in the precise moment we evaluate our environment and realize that the demands being placed upon us are threatening to outstrip our ability to cope. It is a cognitive assessment, a rapid calculation of incoming pressure versus available resources. The heart rate accelerates, the breathing quickens, but the crucial mechanism at play is the mind's evaluation of the struggle. We are burdened, navigating a landscape of unpredictability, yet we are still pushing forward, still attempting to manage the heavy load. When the load becomes entirely unmanageable, we step into the territory of being overwhelmed. This is the equivalent of being blown. It is not merely a higher degree of stress, it is a profound physiological and emotional shutdown. The velocity of life exceeds the nervous system's capacity to process it. In this state, the mind does not need more organization or better coping strategies. It needs absolute stillness. When we are overwhelmed, the only effective intervention is a complete withdrawal from the incoming stimuli. It is the realization that the machinery cannot be repaired while it is still running at top speed. It requires a hard stop, a period of profound non-doing, to allow the fragmented pieces of our cognition to knit themselves back together. This feeling of an accelerating, uncontrollable velocity closely mirrors the shadowy landscape of anxiety. Anxiety is not a static state, it is an escalating trajectory. It feels like being strapped into a vessel hurtling through a pitch-black tunnel. The speed continuously increases, terrifying, disjointed images flash in the periphery, and there is a crushing absence of certainty regarding where this dark current will ultimately deposit us. It is defined by a deep-seated intolerance for the unknown, fueling a relentless anticipation of the worst possible outcome. Anxiety can be an ephemeral visitor, arriving only in high-stakes situations, or it can be a constant lingering shadow woven into the very fabric of our daily existence. In a desperate attempt to regain control over this dark, rushing current, we often resort to two deeply flawed mechanisms: worry and avoidance. Worry is the cognitive manifestation of anxiety. It is the mind spinning its wheels, generating an endless stream of negative future scenarios under the false guise of preparation. We convince ourselves that if we can just imagine every potential disaster, we might somehow prevent them. But worry is not preparation. It is merely suffering in advance. When worry fails to provide relief, we pivot to avoidance. We expend monumental amounts of energy steering clear of the people, places, or situations that trigger our unease. While avoidance may offer a temporary, fleeting sense of safety, it acts as a suffocating enclosure. It shrinks our world, fortifying the underlying fear rather than dismantling it. Yet, the physiological blueprint of anxiety, the racing heart, the shallow breath, the nervous energy, is identical to the physical manifestation of excitement. The body does not distinguish between the two. The difference lies entirely in the narrative we construct. If we label the fluttering in our chest as an impending catastrophe, we experience anxiety. If we label it as anticipation for a positive challenge, we experience excitement. This subtle shift in naming our internal state holds immense power, allowing us to reinterpret our physical sensations and transform paralysis into forward momentum. When our focus remains fixated on a highly probable negative outcome, we enter the agonizing waiting room of dread. Dread is the heavy, sinking weight of inevitability. It makes the anticipation of pain so excruciating that the psyche often begs for the disaster to simply arrive, preferring the acute sting of reality to the prolonged torture of waiting. While anxiety and dread cast our gaze anxiously toward the future, fear violently snaps us into the immediate present. Fear is our primal instinctual response to a clear and present danger. It bypasses cognitive reflection, instantly mobilizing the body to fight, flee, or freeze. It is a biological imperative designed for sheer survival, reacting not only to physical threats, but also to the devastating prospect of social rejection, processing social pain with the same alarming intensity as a physical wound. To navigate these turbulent spaces of uncertainty, fear, and emotional exposure is to stand squarely in the arena of vulnerability. Vulnerability is the core emotional state we inhabit when we are stripped of certainty and forced to risk emotional exposure. Our culture has long propagated the toxic myth that vulnerability is a synonym for weakness, a flaw to be eradicated. We are taught to construct elaborate armor forged from perfectionism and emotional distance to shield our fragile selves. But this armor is a lie. There is no courage without risk. There is no true connection without emotional exposure. To be vulnerable is not to overshare or to bleed onto the stage for the sake of an audience. It is the quiet, terrifying discipline of stepping forward into the unknown without any guarantee of the outcome. It is the birthplace of every meaningful human experience, and it stands as the singular, undeniable measure of our bravery. Chapter 2, Places We Go. When we compare, comparison, admiration, reverence, envy, jealousy, resentment, Schadenfreude, Freudenfreude. The human mind is perpetually assessing its surroundings, instinctively sorting where we stand in the social hierarchy. This reflex, fundamentally rooted in our evolutionary survival, drives us to constantly evaluate our abilities, our possessions, and our very worth against the people around us. Yet, while this drive was designed to keep us safe within the tribe, in the modern landscape, it frequently becomes a silent predator of contentment. When we engage in the act of evaluating our lives through the lens of another's curated reality, we surrender our internal compass. We begin to measure our unvarnished, complex truths against the polished surfaces of others, resulting in a distorted arithmetic where we inevitably come up short. This relentless sorting severs our connection to our inherent value, reducing our identity to a mere ranking rather than an irreplaceable presence. However, looking outward does not always have to result in a deficit of self. When our gaze lands on the exceptional qualities of another and, instead of feeling diminished, we feel uplifted, we move into a space of profound respect. This recognition of greatness inspires rather than threatens. We observe someone's skill, their moral fortitude, or their grace, and we feel a genuine appreciation for their existence. When this appreciation deepens, reaching a profound, almost sacred level of respect, it transcends mere observation and becomes a quiet, powerful awe. In this state, we are not trying to possess what the other person has. Rather, we are moved by their embodiment of an ideal. It reminds us of the vast potential of the human spirit, encouraging our own growth without weaponizing their success against our current state. As we navigate the complex territory of desiring what others possess or protecting what we hold dear, we inevitably encounter two intense emotional states that are frequently used interchangeably in everyday language, yet are fundamentally distinct in their psychological architecture. Understanding the precise boundary between these two feelings is critical for untangling the knots of interpersonal conflict. The first arises when we perceive a lack within ourselves, brought into sharp focus by observing someone else who possesses the very thing we desire. It is a strictly two-person dynamic. We look at another's achievement, their relationship, or their attribute, and a painful longing takes root. It is the ache of wanting. While it can be uncomfortable and bitter, it is not inherently malicious. It is simply the painful recognition of an unmet desire, acting as a mirror reflecting the things we secretly crave for our own lives. In stark contrast, the second emotional state introduces a third variable into the equation. It is not about wanting what someone else has, it is about the terrifying prospect of losing what we already possess to an outside rival. It is driven by the perceived threat to a valued connection or a secure position. When the foundation of a relationship feels unstable, and a third party appears to draw the attention or affection we rely upon, the resulting panic and possessiveness define this specific emotional turbulence. It is a fiercely protective, desperate response to the fear of abandonment or replacement. Deeply entangled with these feelings of unfairness is an emotion often mistakenly categorized as a pure derivative of anger. Yet, upon closer examination, it reveals itself to be intimately tied to the mechanics of comparison and perceived inequity. It stews in the quiet, bitter narrative that we are carrying a disproportionate burden while others are carelessly exempt. We feel this when we are exhausted, overextended, and observing someone else enjoying the rest or boundaries we have denied ourselves. The frustration we project outward is frequently a disguised form of longing for the very boundaries they are honoring. It is an emotional indicator light, flashing red to warn us that we have sacrificed our own needs and we are now penalizing others for having the audacity to protect theirs. When our sense of self-worth is dangerously low and the burden of comparison becomes too heavy, human nature can sometimes take a dark and unsettling turn, finding a sudden, secret spark of satisfaction in the failure or misfortune of another person. This occurs when we temporarily use another's stumble as a makeshift stepping stone to elevate our own fragile ego. It is a hollow victory, a fleeting relief from our own insecurities purchased at the cost of our empathy. It reveals not the cruelty of the observer, but the profound depth of their own internal deficit. The ultimate antidote to this toxic landscape of comparison is the deliberate cultivation of a generous spirit. It is the ability to witness the success, joy, or triumph of another human being and experience a genuine, unforced surge of happiness for them. This is not a passive state, but an active, practiced resonance with another's light. To truly feel joy for someone else's victory requires an unshakable, grounded confidence in our own worth. It demands the profound realization that success and happiness are not finite resources. When we understand that another person's brilliance does not cast a shadow on our own potential, we are finally free to celebrate their ascent as a victory for the human experience as a whole. Chapter 3. Places we go. When things don't go as planned. Boredom, disappointment, expectations, regret, discouragement, resignation, frustration. The human experience is heavily structured around anticipation. We constantly cast our minds into the future, building elaborate architecture out of our hopes, plans, and predictions. But the future is inherently unstable, and reality frequently refuses to conform to the blueprints we have so carefully drawn. When the actual unfolding of events collides with our internal vision, the resulting friction drops us into a complex emotional territory defined by friction and unmet desires. Sometimes this failure of reality to provide what we seek does not arrive with a dramatic crash, but rather with a hollow, restless ache. This is the distinct discomfort of boredom. Boredom is not simply the absence of activity, it is a state of wanting to be engaged, wanting to connect with meaningful stimulation, but finding oneself utterly unable to do so. It is an agitated lethargy. We are trapped in an environment that feels devoid of meaning or interest, yet we possess a lingering, unfulfilled drive to interact. It forces us into a stark confrontation with time itself, making every passing minute feel thick and agonizingly slow. When our plans involve a specific desired outcome that fails to materialize, the emotional fallout generally splits along two distinct pathways, both heavy with the weight of what could have been. These emotional states are born from the same fracture between expectation and reality, but they differ fundamentally in where we assign the agency for the failure. The first pathway is the visceral collapse of our hopes. Disappointment is the profound, sinking crater left behind when a deeply held expectation is broken by reality. It requires a prerequisite of vulnerability. To be disappointed, we must have first cared deeply enough to invest our emotional energy into a specific vision of the future. When that vision shatters, the intensity of the pain is directly proportional to the magnitude of the expectation we were carrying. It is the ache of an unfulfilled promise, whether that promise was made by the world, by another person, or simply by the narrative we constructed in our own minds. The most dangerous architecture we build in our minds consists of the blueprints we never show to anyone else. These unexamined and unexpressed expectations operate like stealth mechanisms within our relationships and our lives. We write detailed internal scripts detailing exactly how a situation should unfold, how a colleague should behave, or how a loved one should demonstrate their affection. We treat these subjective desires as objective contracts. Because these scripts remain hidden, they function essentially as traps. When the people around us inevitably fail to read our minds and do not execute their assigned roles in our silent play, we experience a sharp, punishing disappointment. The subsequent resentment we feel toward them is entirely misplaced, born not from their failure to perform, but from our own profound failure to communicate. The only way to dismantle these hidden traps is through the rigorous, often uncomfortable practice of dragging our assumptions into the light. When we commit to holding examined and expressed expectations, we actively interrogate what it is we truly want, and we brave the vulnerability of voicing it out loud. We transform hidden demands into shared realities. Communicating our hopes does not guarantee that reality will cooperate, and disappointment may still occur. However, when expectations are transparent, a letdown becomes a shared experience rather than a solitary betrayal. It preserves the fabric of connection, allowing us to navigate the broken plan together rather than retreating into isolated bitterness. While disappointment points the finger outward at a reality that failed to deliver, the second pathway turns the lens painfully inward. Regret is the agonizing realization that a better, more desirable outcome might have been achieved if only we had made a different choice. It is not merely sorrow over a bad outcome. It is a heavy cognitive burden that requires us to continuously replay the past. We become trapped in a loop of alternative timelines, torturing ourselves with the belief that our own agency was the singular obstacle to happiness. Regret is a powerful, demanding instructor, forcing us to examine our missteps and align our future choices more closely with our values. Yet if we cannot extract the lesson and release the self-punishment, regret quickly metastasizes into a toxic anchor, preventing any forward movement. When the friction between our desires and our reality ceases to be a single event and becomes a chronic condition, the emotional atmosphere grows increasingly dark. We begin to lose our footing as our motivation slowly drains away. This is the heavy, sinking weight of being discouraged. It is the creeping suspicion that our efforts are entirely futile, a slow erosion of our belief in our own capacity to effect change. If discouragement is left unchecked, it hardens into something much more absolute: resignation. Resignation is the total surrender of hope. It is a bleak, paralyzing acceptance that the current, undesirable reality is permanent and entirely unchangeable. It severs our connection to the possibility of improvement, leaving us hollowed out and detached. Intertwined with this descent, but carrying a much more turbulent energy, is the feeling we get when a goal still feels theoretically attainable, yet is repeatedly blocked by an unyielding obstacle. Frustration is the agitated, restless energy of thwarted momentum. We have the drive, we see the destination, but the path is obstructed by circumstances outside of our control. It is an intensely irritating friction that can easily combust into anger, or, if the barrier proves permanently insurmountable, accelerate our slide directly into the bleak surrender of resignation. Chapter 4. Places we go when it's beyond us. Awe, wonder, confusion, curiosity, interest, surprise. The human mind is engineered to categorize, attempting to place the infinite complexities of the world into neat, manageable boxes. We find safety in knowing how things work and where we stand. Yet there are moments when we encounter phenomena so immense, so breathtakingly vast, that our internal frameworks shatter. This is the profound territory we enter when we confront what is fundamentally beyond our capacity to easily grasp. When we stand beneath a canopy of ancient stars or bear witness to an act of unimaginable human resilience, we are struck by a force that demands we re-evaluate our scale in the universe. This overwhelming sensation is awe. It is the sudden, striking realization of our own smallness, not in a way that diminishes our inherent worth, but in a way that deeply connects us to an unfathomable grandness. Awe forces our gaze outward, effectively silencing the relentless, self-centered chatter of the ego. It is a powerful, transcendent pause. Intimately partnered with this overwhelming vastness is the quieter, yet equally profound state of wonder. If awe is the stunning, breathless impact of the incomprehensible, wonder is the gentle, inquiring spirit that follows in its wake. Wonder takes the shattered pieces of our previous understanding and, rather than feeling threatened by the mystery, feels a deep spiritual motivation to explore it. It is a quiet reverence that invites us to dwell in the presence of the extraordinary without demanding immediate, concrete answers. It allows us to hold the beauty of the unknown in our hands, marveling at the existence of things far greater than our own daily concerns. However, encountering the unknown does not always result in transcendent inspiration or quiet reverence. Often, when we are presented with information that stubbornly refuses to align with our established map of reality, the result is deeply disorienting and uncomfortable. This cognitive friction manifests as a profound lack of clarity. It is the mental equivalent of losing our balance in the dark. We desperately try to force the new puzzle piece into the old picture, and the failure to do so creates a state of intense vulnerability. We are culturally conditioned to view this lack of immediate understanding as a flaw, a sign of intellectual weakness or failure. Yet this cognitive unmooring is entirely necessary. It is the precise, unavoidable threshold we must cross before true, deep learning can occur. To refuse the discomfort of being unmoored is to refuse the very possibility of growth. To navigate our way out of this dark, unmoored space, we rely on the internal mechanisms that drive human discovery and propel us toward clarity. We begin with a baseline cognitive engagement, a gentle focusing of our attention toward something that catches our eye or holds a certain appeal. This state of open reception is a willingness to engage with a topic or a situation without necessarily feeling a burning compulsion to master it. It is a casual invitation to learn more. But when that engagement intensifies, when we become acutely aware of a gap between what we currently know and what we deeply desire to know, we step into a much more demanding emotional space. This intensified drive is not a passive trait, it is a profound, energetic itch. It is an active, restless pursuit of knowledge that requires the brave acknowledgement of our own ignorance. To be truly driven in this way, one must first admit what they do not know. It is a courageous, vulnerable act of seeking, pushing us to ask the hard questions and dismantle our preconceived notions in the relentless pursuit of truth. Occasionally, our confrontation with the unexpected is not a slow realization or a deliberate, methodical inquiry, but a sudden, jolting rupture in the fabric of our present moment. This immediate, involuntary reaction to an unforeseen event is a fleeting shock to our system. It is the shortest-lived of all human emotional responses, serving primarily as a biological emergency override. The mind is momentarily wiped clean of its current trajectory, forced to instantly pivot and assess the new, unpredicted reality that has just presented itself. Because it is so intensely brief, this sudden jolt acts as a crucial emotional bridge. Once the initial shock registers, and the psyche rapidly evaluates the nature of the unexpected event, it seamlessly hands the baton over to a more enduring emotion. We shift rapidly into joy if the sudden disruption brings a welcome gift, or we plummet instantly into fear or anger if the unforeseen event presents a sudden threat. Chapter 5. Places we go. When things aren't what they seem, amusement, bittersweetness, nostalgia, cognitive dissonance, paradox, irony, sarcasm. The human experience is rarely a straightforward, linear path. It is densely layered with contradictions where reality sharply deviates from our initial perceptions. We are constantly interpreting the world, but the world frequently refuses to align with our interpretations. Sometimes this deviation is harmless, taking the form of a sudden, playful twist in our expectations. When we encounter an incongruity that feels entirely safe, a punchline that cleverly subverts our logic, or a situational absurdity that harmlessly defies the rules of normalcy, we experience a delightful momentary spark. This joyful disruption is not merely frivolous. It serves as a crucial social glue. It fosters instant connection, diffuses tension, and offers a necessary physiological release from the rigid, demanding structures of our daily lives. Yet, the coexistence of conflicting realities often carries a much heavier, more profound emotional weight. There are pivotal moments when the heart must expand to accommodate two intensely opposing feelings simultaneously. Imagine standing at the threshold of a monumental life transition, feeling a surging, radiant joy for the future, while concurrently carrying the heavy, pulling grief for the chapter that is permanently closing. This is the agonizing, beautiful ache of holding light and dark in the same hand. It is the acute, painful awareness that life is inherently fragile and transient, and that true, profound beauty is inextricably linked to its inevitable passing. To feel this dual weight is not a sign of emotional confusion or instability. Rather, it is the ultimate testament to a fully engaged, deeply lived life that refuses to artificially separate joy from sorrow. This complex blending of conflicting truths frequently draws our gaze backward through time. We find ourselves suddenly enveloped in a powerful, aching yearning for a previous era, a specific place from our past, or even a version of ourselves that no longer exists. This backward glance is not simply an act of passive memory, it is an active, visceral, emotional longing. It serves as a vital psychological tether, connecting our present identity to the narrative arc of our history. However, this longing carries an inherent danger. When we selectively edit our memories, romanticizing a past that was fundamentally flawed or ignoring its painful realities, we blind ourselves to the present. Used constructively, this yearning anchors us in our personal history. Used defensively, it becomes a seductive retreat from the demanding complexities and responsibilities of the current moment. When the contradiction exists not across time but deeply embedded within our own internal belief systems, the resulting friction is profoundly agonizing. We possess a powerful innate drive to maintain internal consistency. When we are confronted with undeniable new information that violently clashes with our deeply held convictions, or when we catch ourselves behaving in a manner that fundamentally violates our own moral code, the mental distress is severe. To alleviate this agonizing internal tension, the human mind is capable of performing astonishing, often destructive, psychological acrobatics. We will rapidly rationalize, actively ignore indisputable facts, or aggressively attack the source of the conflicting information, all in a desperate, subconscious bid to protect our fragile sense of certainty. Recognizing this severe mental distress for what it is becomes the first, incredibly difficult step toward genuine intellectual and moral growth, demanding that we develop the capacity to tolerate the immense discomfort of being wrong. To mature emotionally and intellectually is to eventually surrender the desperate, childish need for absolute certainty. It is the realization that two seemingly contradictory truths can, and often do, exist in the exact same space. The universe firmly refuses to be neatly divided into simple, easily digestible binaries of good or bad, light or dark, strong or weak. We must deliberately cultivate the capacity to hold opposing ideas without rushing to prematurely resolve the tension between them. We can be deeply, tragically flawed and simultaneously inherently worthy of love and belonging. We can be utterly terrified and profoundly courageous in the exact same breath. True wisdom lies in abandoning the rigid, limiting framework of either-or and boldly stepping into the expansive, deeply complex reality of both and. Unfortunately, the vulnerability required to exist without armor in this complex, contradictory space often drives us to seek the protection of linguistic weaponry. We twist language, deploying words to signify the exact opposite of their literal meaning. While this twisting can occasionally serve as a sharp, insightful critique of a hypocritical world, it far more frequently degenerates into a hostile, protective defense mechanism. We utilize cutting, barbed remarks thinly disguised as humor to systematically strip the power from others and shield our own deep-seated insecurities. This acidic, defensive use of language is ultimately a coward's substitute for authentic communication. It allows us to inflict pain, establish dominance, and momentarily feel superior, all while conveniently and completely avoiding the terrifying risk of direct, honest emotional exposure. At Chapter 6, Places We Go When We're Hurting: Anguish, Hopelessness, Despair, Sadness, Grief. There is a threshold of emotional pain that transcends ordinary sorrow, crossing over into a visceral, full-body trauma. This is the staggering, breathless realm of extreme suffering. It does not merely make us weep, it drops us to our knees. This profound agony is an almost physical tearing apart of the self, a response to a loss or a realization so catastrophic that it shatters our immediate capacity to comprehend it. The mind reels, unable to construct a coherent narrative out of the wreckage, while the body absorbs the shockwaves. It is a transient but absolute state of devastation, where the very core of our being feels fundamentally broken, leaving us gasping for air in the center of an unimaginable void. To understand how we navigate away from, or plummet deeper into, this darkness, we must radically reframe our understanding of the forces that propel us forward. We culturally romanticize the concept of optimism, treating it as a warm, fuzzy feeling or an inherent personality trait. In reality, the mechanism that sustains us is a rigorous, demanding cognitive process. It requires three distinct interlocking gears: the ability to envision a clear goal, the strategic capacity to map out realistic pathways to reach that destination, and the internal fortitude, the agency, to believe we are capable of walking that path. When the environment is supportive and our internal resources are intact, this cognitive engine humors the struggle, allowing us to endure immense difficulty because we possess a map and the legs to walk it. However, when this cognitive machinery begins to fail, the descent is rapid and dangerous. When we look at our circumstances and can no longer identify a viable pathway forward, when every route seems blocked or destroyed, we enter a state of profound barrenness. We lose the belief that our circumstances can change. This is the creeping cold of losing our map. But the true abyss opens when we lose not only the pathways but also our agency. When we fundamentally surrender the belief that we have any power to influence our own lives and we become utterly convinced that tomorrow will be exactly as bleak and punishing as today, we sink into a suffocating, paralyzing darkness. In this profound depth, the spirit ceases to struggle. It is the absolute absence of possibility, an emotional cage where the walls are entirely devoid of doors. Amidst these profound extremes of trauma and surrendered possibility, there exists a more commonplace, yet deeply necessary, emotional landscape. It is the quiet, heavy ache that accompanies loss, disappointment, or a deep, empathetic resonance with the pain of the world. This feeling is not a malfunction. It is a fundamental functional component of the human architecture. It is the psyche's method of processing hardship, demanding that we slow down, turn inward, and honor the friction of our lives. It does not ask to be immediately fixed or aggressively medicated away with toxic positivity. It requires a quiet, compassionate witnessing. To deny this heavy ache is to deny our own humanity, stripping us of the necessary emotional shedding required to heal. When a loss is not merely a passing disappointment but the permanent severing of a profound bond, the resulting emotional response expands far beyond a single feeling. It becomes an all-encompassing, multi-dimensional reckoning. This is an involuntary, full-system disruption that invades every aspect of our existence. It shatters the cognitive mind, exhausting the body and fracturing our spiritual foundation. It is an unruly, unpredictable tide that refuses to adhere to any neat linear stages or convenient timelines. It is the agonizing, deeply personal process of learning to inhabit a reality where an essential piece of our world is irreversibly absent. The work here is not moving on, but integrating the profound absence into the ongoing narrative of our lives. Yet, there are times when this necessary, turbulent tide of mourning refuses to recede, calcifying into a permanent, devastating flood. While navigating profound loss is a natural human process, there is a distinct territory where the natural healing mechanisms fundamentally stall. This occurs when the acute initial agony of the loss remains perpetually frozen in the present moment, severely impairing the ability to engage with life or envision any form of a future. The individual becomes entirely trapped within the gravity of their sorrow, unable to integrate the loss. Recognizing this stalled state is critical, as it requires a different, more intensive form of intervention to gently restart the frozen mechanisms of the heart and allow the necessary, painful work of mourning to resume its natural course. Chapter 7. Places we go with others. Compassion, pity, empathy, sympathy, boundaries, comparative suffering. We do not heal in isolation. The human heart is wired for resonance, yet navigating the suffering of others requires a profound level of emotional discipline and an unshakable belief in our shared humanity. To move toward the pain of another without attempting to violently fix it or cowardly retreat from it requires a foundation of deep, abiding care. This foundation is a daily, intentional practice, a commitment to recognizing that our individual struggles are inextricably linked to the struggles of our fellow humans. It is an expansive, non-judgmental awareness of the suffering present in the world, rooted in the steadfast, humbling belief that absolutely none of us are exempt from the severe trials of the human condition. If this broad, abiding care serves as the foundational belief system, then the active, tactical mechanism required to manifest it in the real world is a highly specialized, rigorous emotional skill set. These two concepts are not identical, rather they exist in a vital, interdependent symbiosis. The overarching commitment to shared humanity provides the necessary spiritual motivation to lean into another's darkness, while the specific, practiced ability to accurately perceive and resonate with their emotional reality provides the essential, weight-bearing bridge. Without the practiced skill, the commitment remains an empty theory. Without the deep commitment, the skill can easily become manipulative, performative, or utterly exhausting. When we encounter severe suffering and lack the courage or the skill to truly descend into the darkness with another person, we often default to a counterfeit emotion that masquerades as care. We observe their pain from a safe, elevated vantage point, instinctively establishing a stark, protective psychological hierarchy. This is the act of looking down upon the afflicted, actively separating our own security from their profound vulnerability. It carries a subtle, toxic undercurrent of superiority, silently declaring that while we may feel genuine sorrow regarding their unfortunate circumstances, we are fundamentally distinct and perhaps inherently insulated from their fate. This elevated stance entirely severs the possibility of genuine connection, leaving the suffering individual isolated and drowning in a deep, dark well of shame. To forge a true, enduring connection requires the brave, deliberate surrender of our elevated vantage point. It demands that we actively dismantle the hierarchy and step down into the suffocating well of another's lived experience. This is a profound, incredibly vulnerable choice. It asks us to temporarily suspend our own worldview and meticulously adopt the perspective of the other person, recognizing their reality as entirely valid, even if it contradicts our own. Furthermore, it requires the immense emotional courage to reach deep into our own internal, guarded catalogue of past traumas to find a resonant feeling actively sharing in their emotional burden without making it our own. It is the sacred, quiet, egoless act of communicating through pure presence, confirming that they are not alone in the abyss. A subtle but dangerous divergence from this deep resonance occurs when we remain entirely separate from the emotional experience, choosing instead to merely react to it from a distance. We offer polished words of comfort from the dry shoreline while the other person thrashes in the heavy current. This response frequently relies on the desperate, anxious attempt to find a silver lining, deploying reflexive phrases designed to minimize the pain or rapidly steer the uncomfortable conversation toward a more positive, easily digestible horizon. While often born of good intentions and a desire to alleviate discomfort, this hasty attempt to paint over the darkness fundamentally invalidates the intense suffering, driving a sharp wedge of disconnection between two individuals who desperately need each other. The profound capacity to step into another person's pain without losing oneself entirely in the process relies entirely on a rigid, fiercely protected internal architecture. There is a pervasive, destructive myth that being deeply connected to others requires infinite, boundaryless accommodation and the total martyrdom-like sacrifice of self. In reality, the most deeply connected and compassionate individuals are those who are fiercely, unapologetically clear about what is acceptable and what is not. This structural architecture dictates the absolute limits of our emotional, physical, and psychological engagement. Without this structural integrity, our attempts to care rapidly deteriorate into total exhaustion and bitter, corrosive resentment. We simply cannot sustain genuine, life-giving care for another human being if we are fundamentally betraying our own inherent need for safety and limits. As we navigate this complex terrain of shared pain and necessary limits, we frequently stumble into a deeply flawed, self-destructive psychological arithmetic. We instinctively attempt to rank our daily hardships against the severe agonies of those around us, falsely believing that if someone else's trauma is objectively worse, our own emotional pain is somehow invalidated or undeserving of attention. This toxic sorting mechanism assumes that empathy is a strictly finite resource, a small pie to be meticulously sliced and distributed only to the most visibly and severely wounded. But human suffering is not a zero-sum game. Denying our own internal friction because another person is facing a more devastating storm does not magically generate more empathy for them. It merely diminishes our own humanity, starving our internal ecosystem of the very grace and acknowledgement we so desperately need in order to heal ourselves and authentically support others. At Chapter 8, Places We Go, when we fall short: shame, self-compassion, perfectionism, guilt, humiliation, embarrassment. The human condition guarantees that we will inevitably stumble. We will make profound errors in judgment, fail to meet our own ideals, and fall short of the expectations set by ourselves and our communities. When we find ourselves in the debris of these failures, the emotional landscape becomes treacherous. The internal narratives we construct in the immediate aftermath of a fall dictate whether we will extract wisdom and repair the damage, or whether we will collapse into an agonizing self-destructive isolation. At the very center of this dark terrain lies a silent, suffocating epidemic that thrives almost entirely in secrecy. It is the intensely painful, visceral conviction that we are fundamentally flawed. It is the heavy, paralyzing belief that our failure is not merely an event that occurred, but a permanent stain on our identity, rendering us entirely unworthy of human connection, love, or belonging. To successfully navigate our way out of this darkness, a vital, razor-sharp distinction must be drawn between two specific emotions that are frequently conflated, yet operate in entirely opposing psychological directions. The first is an evaluation of self. It whispers with devastating absolute certainty, "I am a bad person." It attacks the very core of our identity, erasing any possibility of redemption because the flaw is perceived as inherent, genetic, and unchangeable. This is the emotion that drives us to hide, to lie, and to sever connections. The second emotion, conversely, is an evaluation of behavior. It states, firmly but constructively, "I did a bad thing." This occurs when we have the courage to hold our specific actions up against our deeply held core values and recognize a painful discrepancy. This discomfort is profoundly useful. It creates a cognitive friction that motivates us to apologize, make meaningful amends, and permanently alter our future behavior. Where the former emotion paralyzes the soul and isolates the individual, the latter propels us directly toward accountability, repair, and genuine growth. When our shortcomings are suddenly dragged into the light and exposed to the agonizing gaze of others, the terrain shifts again, introducing dynamics of power and social standing. There is a deep, burning sting that occurs when we are demeaned, degraded, or aggressively belittled by another person. In these moments, we may feel stripped of our dignity and deeply wounded, but buried beneath the pain is a fierce, protective certainty that we did not deserve the attack. This feeling is distinctly different from a total internal collapse because the locus of the wrong remains external. The injustice belongs to the attacker, not to our own character. Lighter, yet still deeply uncomfortable, is the fleeting, hot-faced distress of a public misstep or a sudden social clumsiness. It is a jarring disruption of our perceived normalcy, an acute awareness of being observed in a moment of foolishness. Yet it carries a crucial underlying understanding that this specific brand of foolishness is a universal human experience. It is a temporary awkwardness that, once the immediate heat fades, can often be transformed into a shared story or a joke, ultimately bridging the very social gap it momentarily opened. In a desperate, preemptive bid to avoid the excruciating pain of these social and internal collapses, we frequently construct a heavy, suffocating armor. We convince ourselves that if we can simply look flawless, act flawlessly, and produce entirely flawless work, we will become magically immune to the agonizing arrows of judgment and blame. But this relentless, exhausting pursuit is a dangerous illusion. It is not a genuine, healthy striving for excellence. It is a rigid, defensive posture driven entirely by fear. It is a massive, burdensome shield that we drag through our daily lives, foolishly believing it protects us, when in reality it only prevents us from taking the necessary, vulnerable risks required to truly be seen. It focuses our entire cognitive energy outward, obsessing over the unpredictable perceptions of an audience, rather than directing our focus inward on what we truly desire, value, or need to learn. The singular, potent antidote to this harsh landscape of judgment and self-condemnation is the deliberate, rigorous practice of internal grace. When we find ourselves face down in the arena, having failed publicly or privately, our immediate instinct is almost always self-flagellation. We unleash an internal critic far crueler than any external enemy. Yet, true psychological resilience demands a radical, disciplined shift in this internal dialogue. It requires the immense strength to extend the exact same warmth, understanding, and patient grace to ourselves that we would effortlessly and naturally offer to a loved one in pain. This practice is not a form of weakness, nor does it absolve us of necessary accountability. Rather, it creates the essential psychological safety required to honestly examine our failures without being destroyed by them. By recognizing that making mistakes and experiencing deep pain is a shared, universal thread woven permanently into the fabric of humanity, we break the isolating power of our perceived inadequacies. We replace the heavy armor of perfectionism with the quiet strength of self-acceptance, gently coaxing ourselves back toward connection, accountability, and wholeness. In Chapter 9, Places We Go, when we search for connection, belonging, fitting in, connection, disconnection, insecurity, invisibility, loneliness. The fundamental human drive is not merely to survive, but to intertwine our lives meaningfully with the lives of others. There is a palpable, invisible energy that crackles between individuals when a genuine, unshakable bridge is formed. This vital energy manifests only when people feel deeply seen, truly heard, and inherently valued for exactly who they are, allowing them to give and receive without the heavy, suffocating burden of judgment. It is the lifeblood of our emotional existence, a sacred exchange that anchors us to the world. When this vital energy is fractured, betrayed, or deliberately withheld, we experience a profound emotional deprivation. The severing of this bond leaves a cold, echoing void, creating a massive structural instability in our internal lives that we will desperately, and often destructively, attempt to repair or numb. As we attempt to navigate this complex web of social ties, we frequently find ourselves standing on unstable ground, plagued by a persistent, gnawing doubt about our own worthiness to hold the space we occupy. This internal tremor undermines our confidence, whispering cruel falsehoods that our ties are overwhelmingly fragile, entirely conditional, and constantly on the verge of collapsing. Yet there exists an emotional state even more deeply painful than doubting one's security. It is the agonizing experience of feeling completely erased. To be rendered unseen by the surrounding world, whether through deliberate social exclusion, systemic marginalization, or merely a quiet, continuous indifference, strips away a fundamental layer of human dignity. It creates a suffocating atmosphere where one's voice, individual pain, and very presence fail to register on the radar of the community, leaving the soul starving for the most basic level of human recognition. When this deep hunger for meaningful, validating contact remains persistently unmet over time, we descend into a profound, aching isolation. This state is not defined by physical proximity or the literal absence of people. One can be entirely surrounded by a dense, loud crowd and still feel the crushing, agonizing weight of being entirely separate. It is an internal, subjective perception of social starvation, a painful mismatch between the deep level of intimacy we desperately crave and the shallow, hollow interactions we actually possess. It operates as a primal biological warning system, just as critical and demanding as physical thirst, signaling an urgent emergency that our essential need for a protective, nurturing tribe is dangerously unfulfilled. In our frantic, fear-driven attempts to alleviate this painful isolation and secure a place within the group, we frequently employ a deeply flawed strategy that ultimately betrays our spirit. We carefully assess the environment, meticulously read the room, and rapidly alter our behavior, our opinions, and even our appearance to seamlessly blend into the established mold. We twist ourselves into whatever shape is required to gain entry and avoid the sting of rejection. This is the exhausting, hollow performance of assimilation. It provides a temporary, fragile shield from being outcast, but it demands the severe, devastating cost of self-abandonment. We are granted access to the group, but only because we have successfully hidden who we truly are. True integration, however, demands the exact opposite mechanism. It requires the immense, terrifying courage to stand completely unvarnished and unapologetic in our own truth, regardless of the audience. It is not a physical space we discover in the external world, but a fierce spiritual sanctuary we cultivate within our own hearts. It is the unwavering, grounded conviction that our inherent worth is absolute and not subject to negotiation, editing, or group consensus. When we finally anchor ourselves firmly in this authentic truth, we realize the ultimate paradox of human connection. Genuine acceptance never requires us to fundamentally change our identity to appease the crowd. It absolutely requires us to boldly and vulnerably be exactly who we are. Chapter 10. Places we go. When the heart is open, love, lovelessness, heartbreak, trust, self-trust, betrayal, defensiveness, flooding, hurt. To cultivate deep, authentic connection, the human heart must remain radically, terrifyingly open. Within this expansive, undefended emotional territory, we encounter the most profound and universally sought-after state of being. Yet it is a dangerous misconception to view this state merely as a passive, intoxicating emotion that washes over us by chance. It is in truth an active, rigorous, and daily practice. It is a deliberate commitment to extending oneself for the purpose of nurturing our own and another person's spiritual growth. This profound bond requires consistent, intentional action, a daily demonstration of care, affection, recognition, respect, and deep, unwavering commitment. It is not an endless, unconditional resource. It is a sacred energy generated between individuals only when they actively choose to be deeply seen, known, and valued without the suffocating presence of judgment. Conversely, when the surrounding environment is fundamentally devoid of these vital, sustaining practices, we are plunged into a chilling, desolate psychological space. This is not simply a neutral, quiet absence of affection. It is an active, profound deprivation of the human spirit's essential nutrients. In this barren landscape, the necessary components of mutual respect and nurturing care are systematically replaced by manipulation, emotional neglect, or the agonizing, heavy silence of total indifference. To exist in this state is to be emotionally starved, leaving individuals untethered and desperately struggling to find their inherent worth in a dark void that violently refuses to reflect it back to them. Because opening the heart requires exposing its most tender, completely undefended layers, the wounds sustained in this arena are uniquely devastating. When a profound connection is irreparably severed or a deeply held bond is suddenly fractured, the resulting agony is not a mere poetic metaphor. It is a literal full-body trauma. It is a physical and emotional shattering that feels as though the chest has been cracked open, leaving the individual gasping for air in the wreckage of a shared future. This devastating rupture is the heavy, inescapable tax we must pay for daring to engage in the vulnerable risk of true connection. It is an agonizing, disorienting grief that absolutely cannot be bypassed or rushed. It must be waded through slowly, carrying the jagged fragments of what once was. The entire architecture of this vulnerable connection rests upon a foundation that is not built in grand, sweeping cinematic gestures. Rather, it is meticulously constructed piece by piece in the quiet, seemingly insignificant moments of daily interaction. It is the steady, reliable accumulation of accountability. It is the quiet assurance that another person will consistently hold our vulnerabilities with sacred care, choosing to build an emotional sanctuary where assumed positive intent creates a safe, reliable harbor for the unarmored soul. It demands the continuous, deliberate choice to risk extending faith to another human being, believing in their reliability even when certainty is impossible. Yet, before we can safely extend this profound faith outward to another, we must first secure the most critical relationship of all, the relationship with our own internal compass. We must cultivate a grounded, unshakable belief in our own capacity to make sound judgments, honor our personal boundaries, and reliably protect our own well-being. When this internal foundation is strong, we navigate the external world with quiet grace, knowing that even if we are disappointed by others, we will not abandon ourselves. When this sacred sanctuary of reliance is violated, when an individual actively breaks the established contract of care and safety, the destruction is catastrophic. This deep, profound violation not only demolishes the relationship with the offender, but it sends destructive, agonizing shockwaves deep into our internal foundation. It violently severs the roots of our security, leaving us fundamentally disoriented. We are left not only mourning the loss of the relationship, but violently questioning our own judgment, agonizing over how we could have ever believed the illusion of safety. It is a psychological earthquake that shatters the very lens through which we view the world. In the chaotic aftermath of such a violation, or whenever a perceived attack triggers our deepest unhealed insecurities, the psyche rapidly mobilizes to protect itself from further damage. We instantly pull up the drawbridges, deploying a rigid, impenetrable armor of denial, justification, or aggressive counterattack. We become incapable of hearing the other person, fiercely focused only on deflecting blame and guarding our fragile egos. Simultaneously, the body reacts with a massive, involuntary physiological overload. The heart rate spikes violently, the nervous system completely shorts out, and the capacity for rational, empathetic thought is entirely submerged beneath a suffocating tidal wave of biological panic. This overwhelming physical and emotional surge renders meaningful communication utterly impossible. Beneath the thick armor, the aggressive posturing, and the intense physiological storm, the absolute core of the entire experience is a raw, tender, and deeply agonizing injury to the spirit that desperately needs to be acknowledged and healed. Chapter 11. Places we go when life is good. Joy, happiness, calm, contentment, gratitude, foreboding, joy, relief, tranquility. When the relentless friction of human existence momentarily ceases and the world aligns favorably, we step into a brightly lit emotional territory. Yet even in these positive states, the nuances of our internal landscape are critical. We frequently mistake the passing weather for the enduring climate. There is a profound structural difference between the circumstantial warmth of a favorable outcome and the intense spiritual fire of a deep connection. One state is tied directly to our environment, our achievements, and our external realities. It is a stable, recognizable state of being pleased with how life is unfolding, intimately connected to our cognitive appraisal of our circumstances. It makes sense to the logical mind. The other state, however, is a sudden, breathtaking surge of intense resonance. It is not a permanent plateau. It is a rapid, illuminating spark. It is an overwhelming, transcendent appreciation for the present moment that completely bypasses logic, momentarily blurring the boundary between the self and the universe. Beyond these soaring, active heights, there exists a profound, necessary quiet. We seek this peaceful equilibrium in two entirely distinct forms. The first is an active, rigorous internal discipline. It is the conscious, deliberate slowing of the mind and the physical body when surrounded by chaos or provocation. It requires taking a deep breath and deliberately carving out a sacred, quiet pause between an external trigger and our internal reaction. It is a practiced armor against anxiety and emotional reactivity. The second form of peace is not an action we take or a discipline we enforce. It is a space we enter. It is a profound, effortless stillness. It is an environment entirely free from turbulence, demands, or the urgent need for action. It is the perfectly smooth, quiet water we rest upon when absolutely no storms are blowing. Embedded deeply within this quiet space is a revolutionary acceptance of the present reality. In a world that relentlessly demands we strive for more wealth, more status, more relentless self-improvement. Embracing the absolute sufficiency of the current moment is a radical act. It is the quiet, deeply settled satisfaction of having arrived. It is the visceral realization that our current state, our current possessions, and our fundamental selves are entirely enough. This state does not preclude the possibility of future growth, but it completely severs the toxic, exhausting tether between our core self-worth and the endless, insatiable accumulation of external validation. To sustain this deep satisfaction and fully absorb the brightest moments of our lives, a vital, active mechanism is required. Recognizing the good in our lives cannot be a passive, fleeting thought. It must be a rigorous, practiced discipline. It is the deliberate, conscious act of acknowledging and honoring the gifts, the connections, and the beauty we experience. This active recognition is the essential, grounding anchor for our most intense moments of spiritual connection. Without this intentional practiced awareness, our highest highs evaporate into the atmosphere without permanently altering our spiritual architecture. However, our capacity to tolerate these unshadowed, soaring moments is often shockingly frail. When we find ourselves standing on the absolute peak of a beautiful, unblemished experience, watching a loved one sleep, or standing in the center of a monumental personal victory, a dark, chilling terror frequently invades the sacred space. We suddenly, violently imagine the absolute worst-case scenario. We brace for a catastrophic impact, terrified that the universe will inevitably and painfully snatch the beauty away. We mistakenly believe that if we continuously rehearse tragedy in our minds, we can somehow mitigate its devastating sting when it arrives. This is the tragic paradox of our most profound joys. They are inherently our most vulnerable moments. In a desperate, misguided attempt to protect ourselves from future heartbreak, we actively destroy the beauty of the present. The only effective weapon against this agonizing rehearsal of loss is to consciously pivot away from the terror and lean aggressively into the active, deliberate practice of appreciation. Finally, there is the profound physical release that washes over the body and mind when a heavy, agonizing burden is lifted or an anticipated disaster miraculously fails to strike. It is the deep, visceral exhale of the human soul. The tightened, defensive muscles finally unravel, the long-held breath escapes, and a sudden, undeniable lightness rushes into the space previously occupied by dread. It is a powerful, striking reminder of exactly how heavily we carry our fears, a weight fully realized and understood only in the exact, brilliant moment we are finally permitted to set it down. Chapter 12. Places we go. When we feel wronged. Anger, contempt, disgust, dehumanization, hate, self-righteousness. When our boundaries are violently crossed, our core values threatened, or a perceived injustice strikes the heart, the human psyche rapidly arms itself. We enter a dark, volatile, and highly energized emotional territory defined by friction and retaliation. At the very forefront of this defensive line is a fierce, consuming emotional response that demands immediate attention. This is the flashing, urgent indicator light on the dashboard of our emotional lives. It is a vital biological and psychological surge signaling that something fundamental is deeply wrong and requires intervention. Yet, while this fiery surge is an extraordinary catalyst for initiating movement and an absolutely necessary fuel for demanding justice, it is an exceptionally poor compass for long-term navigation. It is almost exclusively a secondary emotional layer, a thick protective shield deployed rapidly to mask much more vulnerable, excruciating feelings like profound grief, paralyzing fear, or absolute powerlessness. If we do not possess the courage to step behind the flames and rigorously examine the raw, bleeding wounds it is desperately trying to protect, the fire will simply burn uncontrolled, eventually consuming both the perceived enemy and ourselves. When a perceived wrong fundamentally violates our internal moral baseline, our reaction deepens from fiery retaliation into a visceral, full-body rejection. The human organism possesses a primal biological imperative designed to protect the physical body from toxic ingestion. When applied to the emotional realm, this same mechanism works to protect the psyche from moral contamination. We physically and spiritually recoil. However, when this profound recoil is weaponized against another human being and combined with a toxic, elevated sense of superiority, it calcifies into the most corrosive force known to human connection. This is not merely an intense disagreement, it is the absolute icy dismissal of another person's fundamental worth. It looks down from a fabricated, arrogant height and declares the other individual to be entirely beneath consideration, fundamentally flawed, and unworthy of respect. It is an acidic disrespect that actively dissolves the very foundations of a relationship, making genuine reconciliation nearly impossible. The descent from individual, interpersonal conflict to systemic, catastrophic atrocity requires a highly specific, deeply insidious psychological mechanism.
Human beings are generally incapable of inflicting severe, unconscionable harm upon those we truly recognize as equals. Therefore, to enact profound cruelty without shattering our own moral framework, the mind must deliberately and systematically strip the target of their essential humanity. This dark alchemy relies entirely on the strategic, relentless manipulation of language and imagery, reducing complex, deeply feeling human beings into animals, vermin, or monstrous threats. This process is never an accident. It is a meticulously crafted, deliberate narrative designed to surgically bypass our inherent biological aversion to causing pain. Once a group is successfully pushed outside the protective boundary of human empathy, violence against them is no longer viewed as a horrific crime, but rather as a necessary, even righteous, cleansing. It is the terrifying, absolute prerequisite architecture for every major historical atrocity. Thriving fiercely in the toxic, barren soil of this systemic dehumanization is the most destructive and consuming of all human emotional states. This is not merely an intense dislike or a passing grievance. It is a profound, active, and enduring hostility. It is fueled by an intricate, volatile mixture of deep-seated fear, a magnified sense of injury, and a desperate, driving need to completely eradicate the source of the pain. It requires absolute, uncompromising polarization, violently severing all nuanced thought and demanding total allegiance to a rigid us versus them ideology. It is a devastatingly heavy armor that fundamentally distorts the soul of the person who chooses to carry it, permanently binding them in a dark, twisted symbiosis to the very object of their loathing. To shield ourselves from the terrifying complexities of this dark emotional landscape and to protect our fragile egos from the grueling work of self-reflection, we frequently retreat into an impenetrable fortress of moral superiority. This is the smug, unyielding certainty that our perspective, our beliefs, and our actions are not only correct but universally ordained, while all opposing views are fundamentally corrupt and evil. It is a total intellectual and emotional dead end. It violently shuts down all genuine curiosity, instantly extinguishing the very possibility of empathetic engagement or shared understanding. By convincing ourselves that we exclusively possess the absolute moral high ground, we effectively grant ourselves permission to be cruel, blinding ourselves to our own deep, contributing flaws, and ultimately becoming the very architects of the disconnection we so loudly claim to despise. Chapter 13. Places we go to self-assess. Pride, hubris, humility. The human psyche possesses an inherent, relentless drive to turn its gaze inward, constantly attempting to measure its own worth, establish its position, and evaluate the significance of its contributions to the world. We are perpetually engaged in a quiet, deeply personal audit of our character and our achievements. When this internal assessment is grounded in reality, it serves as a vital navigational tool, helping us align our actions with our deepest values. However, when the metrics of this self-evaluation become distorted by ego, insecurity, or a desperate need for external validation, the resulting emotional landscape becomes highly precarious, dictating whether we will forge meaningful connections or retreat into isolating arrogance. When we invest significant, sustained effort into a difficult task, a challenging relationship, or the fierce pursuit of a meaningful goal, and that effort yields a positive outcome, the resulting internal warmth is a deeply necessary, profoundly healthy emotion. It is the quiet, internal celebration of our own agency. This positive self-assessment is not rooted in the diminishment of others. It is a standalone recognition of our own dedication, resilience, and growth. It allows us to briefly pause, stand in the light of our own accomplishments, and internalize the hard-won belief that we are capable of effecting change in our own lives. This healthy satisfaction fuels our motivation, building the necessary internal confidence to face future challenges without requiring us to violently defend our egos. However, there is a severe, highly destructive mutation of this positive self-assessment. When the focus violently shifts away from honoring the specific effort expended and instead becomes fixated on an inflated, untouchable sense of inherent superiority, we cross a perilous boundary. This toxic state is not merely an overestimation of one's own abilities, it is a profound, dangerous detachment from reality. It operates as a heavy, impenetrable armor of arrogance, demanding constant external validation while aggressively deflecting any form of criticism. This inflated self-image fundamentally blinds the individual to their own inevitable flaws and severely limits their capacity for empathy. It creates an environment where every interaction is viewed through the lens of dominance and submission, ultimately resulting in profound isolation, as genuine connection is utterly impossible with someone who refuses to step off their self-constructed pedestal. The profound, stabilizing counterweight to this dangerous inflation is a concept frequently and tragically misunderstood in modern culture. We are routinely taught to conflate it with meekness, chronic self-deprecation, or the deliberate shrinking of oneself to ensure the comfort of others. In truth, this grounding virtue is an act of immense, quiet strength. It requires an unshakable, deeply rooted internal security. It is the capacity to accurately and honestly assess both our formidable strengths and our glaring weaknesses without feeling the desperate need to violently defend our ego. To inhabit this grounded space is to maintain an expansive, radical openness to the world. It is the willingness to be taught, the courage to be entirely wrong, and the deeply held conviction that our perspective is merely one fragment of a vastly larger truth. It allows us to hold our greatest accomplishments with grace, recognizing that our successes are inextricably linked to the contributions of others and the unpredictable whims of circumstance. Ultimately, it is the profound realization that we are fundamentally, permanently, and beautifully a work in progress, allowing us to walk through the world with a quiet confidence that never requires the diminishment of another human soul.